Hey, what's going on? What are we doing today? We're doing, hold on a minute, hold on. Feel the power building. Today, we're going to cover two stories that are of the strange but true variety. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. Not 3, 4, 5 times a week. I know, but it's still pretty good. We're still doing it, okay? Still pretty good. So, if that's of interest to you, please install hidden cameras all around the Like Button's house, and then live stream those cameras to Facebook. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of June 20th, 2005, a 40-year-old man named Wang Diang stood just inside the doorway of a little home in rural northeastern China. Outside, it was pouring rain with all this crazy thunder and lightning, and also there were these hailstones coming down the size of golf balls, smashing into everything. I mean, just the impact on the roof must have been so loud. And so as Wang was standing in the doorway, he was actually looking out in the direction of the storm because all these people were running towards him to come in the house. Wang was actually hosting a wake for a friend, and he was hosting this wake at this man's home. And all the people running up to him were all the mourners coming to pay their respects. Now, by this point, most of the mourners had already made it inside the house, and so Wang was basically just waiting for the last few stragglers to make their way inside. And so from his post at the door, Wang is watching the storm and all these people, and he also took stock of the fact that as he looked out to the big tobacco fields that kind of were all over the place in this town, that was the primary way people made money in this town, he noticed that, there was nobody out there tending the crops. And even in rainstorms, people would tend these crops because this was their livelihood, but Wang understood why nobody was out there. Yes, it was the storm, but specifically, lately there had been these crazy lightning strikes in storms like this that struck the field. And so these workers that were normally out in the fields every single day, they weren't doing that anymore. Finally, the last couple arrived, and Wang greeted them and brought them inside, and then he shut the door and then began making his rounds inside the home, making sure all the guests had what they needed, and also just kind of making sure the wake was, overall a positive experience, all things considered. Now, to be clear, Wang was not a monk or a priest or even a relative of the person who was deceased. Instead, he was just kind of like the guy that emceed virtually all events in this town. So if there was weddings, he was the guy who officiated the weddings, and if there were funerals or wakes or things of that nature, also Wang was often tapped to MC that as well. He was kind of like the village elder, if you will, even though he was only 40 years old. And Wang, he really treasured the fact that he was the guy that got to do these things, and so he put a lot of time and energy into making sure they went extremely well. So, on this day, as he was making his rounds, checking in with all the mourners, nobody really needed anything, and so Wang sort of felt like he didn't have a role, and he scanned around the room looking for something else he could do that would be productive, and he noticed the incense near the casket was going out. And so Wang walked over, he pulled out the extinguished incense, he got a new stick of incense, put it in, and he lit it, and then he just kind of stood over the casket and closed his eyes and began saying a silent prayer for the dead. And as Wang did this, suddenly there was this deafening roar, and then everything went black. A few seconds later, that deafening roar faded, and it was replaced by the sound of all the mourners in the house basically screaming and trying to figure out what just happened. And so as people began kind of trying to size up the situation, they saw there was all this smoke near the casket and there was all these wooden debris everywhere. And then people looked up at the ceiling and they saw there was now a pretty good sized hole that had blackened char around the edges of the hole that was kind of smoldering. And then unfortunately, once the smoke really had kind of dissipated, Wang was laying right underneath this hole in the roof, and half of his head was gone. It was very clear he was deceased. And it didn't take long for mourners to figure out what had happened. Wang had unfortunately been struck by lightning. 2 days later, Wang's family held a funeral for Wang, and basically the entire village showed up for this funeral because remember, Wang was really a central member of this community, and so it was a really big loss that he was now dead. And candidly, this only stoked the fears that everybody had about lightning strikes. I mean, this was really becoming a huge issue. But after the funeral ended and Wang had been placed into a hearse and driven off to the crematorium to be cremated, the people at this funeral who were kind of making their way out began kind of talking a little bit more candidly about what had happened to Wong. I mean, it was obvious he was struck by lightning, but in this town, there was a lot of superstition around deaths like this, when it seems like how he died is almost like an act of God. I mean, how many people get struck by lightning? Even if you're scared of being struck by lightning, that is a very rare phenomenon, and everybody knew that. And so the mourners couldn't help but suspect that maybe Wong was not this incredible person that everybody loved. Maybe he had deep, dark secrets, and the way he was killed was like God's punishment, smiting him for the terrible things he was hiding. But nonetheless, the mourners who had just left the funeral followed tradition and actually walked over to the local crematorium where Wong would be cremated. Basically, it's the absolute final goodbye, and typically the family will stay there and wait for all the people to come by and pay their final respects, and then at that point the family hands off their loved one in their casket to the manager of the crematorium, and the cremation process begins. And so all that happens, all the mourners go to the crematorium, they pay their final respects, and then before long, Wong's family was brought inside the crematorium with the manager, and they were placed in this quiet room to kind of wait for this process to happen. And then the manager left them and went down the hall to the furnace room where Wong's casket was waiting for him. So the furnace room inside of this crematorium is basically like this big industrial space where in the middle is this huge, intimidating metal furnace, which is actually where, the bodies are slid in and burned until they're just ash. And so picture like the biggest oven you've ever seen with a big metal rectangular door and these rails that slide directly into this furnace, and the casket is placed on those rails and then kind of fed into the furnace. They seal the door and then of course ignite the furnace, and then the cremation begins. And so the manager, who had done this many, many times, walked up to Wong's casket, which was already placed on the rails. So workers had already set it up for this process before he came in. And so the manager walks up to the casket, he opens it up, he sees Wong's body, and he confirms that Wong is just wearing a robe with a belt, and he did not have any jewelry or metal on him or anything like that, which was not allowed during the cremation process. And so feeling confident that this was all good, he shut the casket and then slid the casket into the furnace. He shut the door, the big metal door, locked it, and then started the furnace. And as soon as he hit it, the manager heard the familiar sound of gas hissing as the gas kind of filled up the inside of the space, and then the familiar whooshing sound of the flames igniting. But as the manager kind of stepped away from the front of this furnace and was kind of making his way back towards the door, he noticed there was another sound coming from inside of this furnace. It was a hissing sound, but different than the gas sound. This was something else. And then before long, the hissing got louder and louder and louder. And then finally, there was this massive explosion inside of this furnace. And so smoke is pouring out of the sides. It was unbelievable that the furnace itself even held its shape. I mean, something massive had detonated inside of this thing. And in fact, even though that door that seals the furnace shut, even though it had not been blown off, the force of whatever detonated inside of there was so strong that the manager actually was knocked backwards from the blast. And so in a panic, he got up, and there's smoke filling the room, and there's flames kind of dancing out of the edges of this metal door in front of the furnace, and he hits the emergency stop, and the flames cut, but it's still all smoky and it's totally chaotic, and workers are rushing into the room to figure out what's going on, and the manager had no idea. This was something he had never, ever seen before. Just minutes later, firefighters arrived and basically extinguished the remaining flames that were kind of residually burning inside of the furnace and slightly outside of the furnace. Remember, this was a significant explosion, so there are cracks and breaks all over the furnace where some flames were still lit. But finally, the firefighters did extinguish all the flames, and then after it was safe to be in there, an investigation was launched as to what the heck happened in there. And so police officers went into this room and began sifting through all the debris in this room, both inside of the furnace itself and also, outside where it had cracked and things had shot off in different directions. And for a while, they found nothing. I mean, all they found were basically pieces of Wong, ash and some bone and some tissue from him. But there was nothing else that was unusual. But at some point, one of the officers did find something that was unusual. He found a piece of metal that was inside of the furnace that clearly should not have been there. Because remember, it's not allowed to have metal or jewelry or anything on the deceased when they're brought into the furnace. And considering what happened, they're like, okay, does this have something to do with the explosion? And so the officers kind of huddled around this metal and they began kind of cleaning it off to see if there was anything written on it. It's not a very big piece of metal. And eventually they had cleaned it off enough that they realized there was something written on it, and it absolutely explained what had happened here. So to understand what happened, you need to have an understanding of how the Chinese government responds to severe storms like the one that was going on the day that Wang was struck by lightning. So remember, Wang's village had all these tobacco fields all over the place, which was not only how the villagers made their living, but also China as a whole. They need these crops to be bountiful. And these huge storms that produce those golf ball sized pieces of hail, those can severely damage tobacco crops. And the Chinese government doesn't want that to happen. And so the Chinese government has set up these things called weather bureaus, which are these government agencies all across the country whose job is to try to weaken these storms. And the way they do that is very interesting. They use a chemical called silver iode that they put into the actual storm clouds. And what silver iode does is it attracts ice particles and water. And so with this chemical up in the clouds, it kind of breaks up the hail a little bit and either makes them really small. And sometimes this chemical can actually completely destroy the hail and convert it from hail to just plain old rain, which is great. So how do these weather bureaus and this silver iode have anything to do with what happened to Wang? Well, unfortunately for Wang, the way these weather bureaus in China actually get this silver iode up into the clouds is they basically take a rocket launcher and fire a literal rocket, like an explosive device, that contains this silver iode inside of it, and the rockets get fired up into the sky, into the clouds where they detonate, and then the silver iode is kind of sprinkled all throughout the clouds. And unfortunately, on the day Wang was killed, one of those rockets were fired into the sky, and this rocket, it goes up, 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 it goes into the cloud, but it doesn't detonate. It turns around and falls straight down, and it just so happens to go straight through that roof into Wang's head, blowing off a portion of his head. And then the rocket itself got embedded in his torso and did not detonate. And then when he was wheeled off to the crematorium and slid into the furnace, and that manager turned on the furnace, that hissing sound he began hearing right before the explosion was the sound of that rocket inside of Wang's torso heating up and then finally detonating. When the police officers found that little piece of metal, what they had found was actually a piece of the rocket itself. And when they cleared it off, they saw there was a serial number for that particular Weather Bureau rocket. And so that was how they were able to solve this mystery. 3 years after Wang's death, the Chinese government came out and said, yep, this is our fault. We did this. And so they compensated Wang's family 80,000 yuan, which is equal to about 12,000 US dollars. And while that's a pretty underwhelming settlement to be paying for somebody's life, what is significant that came out of this case is following Wang's death, the Chinese government altered their rockets that they fired into these clouds, and they added this feature where if for some reason the rocket goes into the cloud and doesn't detonate, it will automatically deploy a parachute and will safely fall to the ground and not detonate. All right, I have some bad news for you. Siga Lung is missing. You see, it all started about 4 years ago when I began feuding with the like button. You know, doing silly pranks like, rattling up a hornet's nest and jamming it inside the like button's toilet, or, releasing angry honey badgers into their vacation home. Just fun stuff. But lately, the like button has begun to retaliate, and it's escalating quickly. Just the other day, old Siga Lung received a package in the mail. He opened it up, and boom, it was a brand new lily pad. He was so excited, he hopped on it, getting ready to settle in for a nap, when he suddenly realized this was not a normal lily pad. This one was riddled in poison ivy and also strapped to the brim with fireworks and explosives. It was obviously the work of the like button. And the second Lung tried to move, it detonated, sending Lung flying across the yard. And it was at that point that something happened to Siga Lung. He got laser vision and realized he was going to exact his revenge on the like button once and for all. And before I could stop him from going rogue, he was gone. And so unfortunately, it's now been a week and I still have not heard or seen Lung. And so naturally, I did the only thing anybody would do in this position, and that is I created a limited time merch drop. I created a brand new limited Lungy merch line commemorating our rogue comrade. Right now, you can go to shopmrballin.com and check out the entire Lungy merch line that's only available for a limited time. We have a new graphic tee and tank top. We have a new pin that everybody loved. Those sold out so fast last time. There's a sticker set. There's even coasters. I mean, if you're into Siga Lung, which I think a lot of you are, It's pretty good, but you gotta act now because I promise you this stuff is not gonna stick around. It's gonna sell out quickly. So go get your lungy merch before it's too late. Again, shopmrballin.com and get your Seagull Lung merch, which is your way of supporting Lung on his mission to destroy the like button. Enjoy. On January 30th, 1989, two young men were working the afternoon lunch shift at a Domino's Pizza restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. Their names were Daryl Wilson and Sean Burnset. And most weeks, this shift that they worked together was really boring because virtually nobody came into the restaurant. But on this day, at around 11 a.m., as Daryl and Sean are kind of twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the shift to end, a man who was obviously disgruntled and very agitated stormed in the door carrying a gun, a .357 Magnum gun, so a really powerful handgun, and he aimed it straight at them. Daryl and Sean were so shocked by this that at first they didn't do anything. But then it kind of dawned on them that, oh my goodness, this guy's coming in here to rob the place. And so Daryl and Sean suddenly put their hands up and they begin saying, okay, take whatever you want, take whatever you want. And the man suddenly began shouting something at them like he wanted something. And it took Daryl and Sean a second to kind of understand what he was asking for. But when they started to process the things he was saying, they kind of understood that this did not seem like a robbery. The guy was demanding that they call Tom S. Monahan so he, this guy, the guy with the gun, can talk to Tom. Now, Daryl and Sean may have known this, but probably not, because they likely didn't care. But Tom S. Monahan, at the time, was the owner of Domino's. Not like this particular restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia, but like the entire national chain. He was the actual owner of the company. And so this guy is coming in being like, let me talk to the owner of Domino's. And so at some point, Daryl and Sean understood who Tom S. Monahan was. Perhaps the guy with the gun explained it, or maybe one of them did know who Tom S. Monahan was. But either way, Daryl and Sean suddenly realized, oh my goodness, this guy wants to talk to the owner. But they have no way of getting in touch with the owner of Domino's. They're just pizza cooks. They're not like connected to the C-suite. But when Daryl and Sean told the guy like, hey, we don't know how to get in touch with the literal owner of this major franchise, well, the guy didn't like that. And he got really frantic and began yelling and screaming like, you gotta do it! You gotta get Tom on the phone! And so Daryl and Sean are like, okay, and they grab the phone and they try to call their own boss because they don't know who else to call. And as they're calling their own boss, this guy fires 2 shots into the ceiling. So this is like a really high intensity situation that's escalating really quickly. But Daryl, who actually was the one on the phone, he did his best to stay calm, and when his boss got on the other line, he tried his best to explain the situation as quickly as he could, because he could tell, this guy with the gun is very close to potentially shooting them. And the boss of Daryl and Sean did understand, okay, clearly there is a crisis happening at this branch. And when Daryl said, you gotta find a way to get Tom S. Monahan on the phone, like right now, well, his boss was like, I got it. And a few minutes later, Daryl's boss, who's still on the phone with him, was like, okay, I'm gonna patch you through. And then a second later, Tom S. Monahan hops on the phone and he's like, what's going on? And at this point, Daryl just handed the phone over to the guy with the gun and said, here you go, Tom's on the phone. And the man with the gun grabbed the phone, put it to his ear, and then began rattling off these totally bizarre demands. He wanted a white limousine to show up to the restaurant to be his getaway car. He wanted $10,000 in cash, and he wanted a copy of a science fiction novel about the Freemasons called The Widow's Son. And so Daryl and Sean, who are behind the counter witnessing this, they're hearing these demands and it's clicking for them that clearly this guy is not mentally well. This is a guy who's totally unhinged and who knows what's going to happen. After a few minutes on the phone, the gunman hung up and then told Daryl and Sean very calmly that now the 3 of them were just going to sit in this restaurant and wait for his demands to be met. And for the next 5.5 hours, that's what they did. Daryl, Sean, and the gunman, who just kept the gun aimed at Daryl and Sean, they just sat inside of this restaurant. And at the same time, by this point, the police have been called and they're completely surrounding this restaurant. And when the gunman came into the store, because this was a very slow day, there weren't any other customers or staff inside. So it really was just Daryl, Sean, and the gunman. And so it's a total standoff. But interestingly, for Sean and Daryl, who were right there with this gunman, they started to sense that this guy was not here to hurt them. He was really after Tom S. Monahan, and over those 5.5 hours they were just sitting there with him with his gun aimed right at them, he periodically began telling them, what his gripes were with Tom S. Monahan. The gunman told Daryl and Sean that Tom was specifically targeting him, the gunman, And also, Tom was secretly communicating with the gunman when the gunman didn't want to talk to him, almost like telekinesis or something. And also, the gunman told them that Tom S. Monahan periodically will walk around his property at night, kind of creeping around, scaring the gunman. And Daryl and Sean, they're hearing these things and not believing any of it, but they were very empathetic and said, oh yeah, I can understand why that would be an issue. I can understand why you'd come in here and demand to speak to Tom S. Monahan. Yep, totally get it. And that was just kind of how the day was going. And then around 4:30 p.m., so they've been in there a long time by this point, the gunman told Daryl and Sean that he was really hungry, so they better go make him some pizzas. So Daryl and Sean just got up, they went in the back, they made 2 large everything pizzas, and after they were made, they put them in boxes and slid them across the counter to the gunman. And at this moment, Daryl and Sean knew the gunman, in order to eat, would have to put his weapon down to open up the box and get the pizza. And so the second they handed it over, without even communicating with each other, they kind of waited for the gunman to put the gun down. And he did. He put the gun down, he opened the pizza up, he grabbed a slice, and at that moment, Daryl and Sean began sprinting past him towards the door, and the gunman, who's seeing this happen, he drops the pizza, he grabs the gun, and he turns, and he aims. So to really understand what's happening here, you need to understand what type of marketing Domino's, like the national franchise, was doing to advertise their product. Starting in 1985, Domino's came up with a very popular advertising campaign called The Noid. And the Noid was actually a character. It was like this weird claymation character with big sneakers and bunny ears. He was like this goofy thing that was the equivalent of McDonald's Hamburglar, but this was for pizza. And what Domino's did with the Noid is they would run these ads on TV where the Noid was like this menace who was always out to disrupt pizza deliveries. Not necessarily Domino's pizza deliveries, but generally pizza deliveries, it's like the Noid's gonna destroy them, either by, freezing the pizzas on their way to the person's house, or smashing them into the ground, or causing whatever mayhem the Noid could create to stop pizzas from getting to their customers. And so Domino's kind of catchy thing was avoid the Noid with Domino's. Meaning like Domino's, the chain, was the only chain capable of avoiding all the chaos that could disrupt you getting the thing you want, your pizza. And this advertising campaign was brilliant, not only because it really worked, people really liked Domino's because it did seem like they were superior, but also they were able to kind of franchise this character itself, the Noid. It became a toy you could buy, and there was talk about doing a TV show and maybe a movie around this Noid character. And Michael Jackson, like the king of pop, he put the Noid in one of his music videos. I mean, this was a really, really successful advertising campaign, but for as successful as this campaign was, it did unfortunately lead to what happened inside of this Domino's restaurant in Chamblee, Georgia. So on the day this gunman came charging in and held up the place, aiming the gun at Sean and Daryl, it would turn out the gunman's name was Kenneth Lamar Noid. And Kenneth Lamar Noid was not going into the store to get money or to steal food or to hurt, Daryl or Sean. He was there to get his revenge on Tom S. Monahan, who he looked at as the person responsible for coming up with this Noid campaign. Because Kenneth Lamar Noid was very mentally ill, and he believed the Avoid the Noid campaign was not a marketing campaign, but rather Tom S. Monahan specifically targeting Kenneth Lamar Noid, basically making him out to be this big villain. But Kenneth's plan for how to deal with this totally backfired, because in a totally ironic twist, by holding up this Domino's franchise and creating this huge standoff, he literally became like the Noid because no pizza deliveries could be had that entire day out of that franchise. And so Kenneth Lamar Noid, in an effort to stop Tom S. Monahan from running this Noid campaign, because I'm no villain, I don't go after pizzas, I don't try to stop people from getting their pizzas, in an effort to do that, that is exactly what he did. He literally became the human version of the Noid. And so after Daryl and Sean made a run for it towards the door, Kenneth did grab his gun and he did aim it at the two men, and he even fired it a couple of times, but he missed, and Daryl and Sean were totally unhurt. In fact, nobody got hurt. All that happened is Kenneth Lamar Noid looked like the Noid, and he got arrested. However, instead of going to jail, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. As for the actual advertising campaign itself, which was very successful, Avoid the Noid, well, it would not survive this total PR nightmare, and Tom S. Monahan canceled it immediately after Kenneth Lamar Noid was taken off. So in a weird way, Kenneth actually did sort of get his revenge.
Avoid the Noid. Domino's Pizza delivers. Call now.
Hey everybody, just a reminder, we do have that new limited merch line that's all around Sigo Lung and him going rogue. There's the new graphic tee and tank top, there's the new pin, there's coasters, there's a sticker set. It's all really good stuff. Go to shopmrballin.com and get your Sigo Lung merch to help support our rogue comrade who's going out there to get his revenge on the like button. Shopmrballin.com, go get that sweet, sweet Sigo Lung merch now. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, remember we have multiple podcasts under the Ballin Studios umbrella. We have Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories with hundreds of stories, many of which are not on YouTube. They're just on the podcast. We also have Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. We have Runful, Bedtime Stories. All you got to do is go on any podcast platform and look up Ballin Studios, and boom, you got a whole bunch of stories you can go binge. Until next time, thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. In the early evening of August 28th, 2003, 83-year-old Eric Hingston was sitting up in bed trying to catch his breath in the small village of Plympton in the southwest of England. Eric's 81-year-old wife, Audrey, fluffed up a pillow behind him to make sure he was as comfortable as possible. She kissed her husband on the cheek, walked across the small upstairs bedroom, and opened up the window. A cool summer breeze blew in, and Eric instantly seemed to relax. For the past 3 years, Eric had been dealing with a series of health issues. He could only walk short distances with the help of 2 canes, he had heart problems, and he had a catheter. But despite these health issues, his wife, Audrey, had worked hard to give Eric as active a life as possible. And for years, together, they had managed to do just that. But recently, Eric had also begun to suffer from severe asthma, and so he struggled to breathe a lot of the time. He had tried different medicines and treatments, but sitting upright in his bed with the window open seemed to be the only thing that brought him any relief. Audrey turned from the window and looked back at her husband on the bed, and she smiled. She could see his breathing had started to slow down, and he had a calm look on his face now. Eric gave a little smile back to his wife, but it was obviously forced. He hated that he was stuck in bed so much of the time lately. It was just not how he'd imagined his life playing out. And a big reason for that was because Eric had spent the early part of his life in peak physical condition, facing dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. When he was a young man, he joined the Royal Air Force, and he had become a highly decorated World War II pilot who flew covert missions into occupied France. After leaving the military, he no longer risked his life on a regular basis, but he still pushed himself to work hard all the time and to accomplish any goals he set for himself. Eric got married to his first wife, they started a family, and he opened and ran a very successful neighborhood butcher shop that was located below the house where he still lived. And so for decades, Eric had been a highly respected war hero, business owner, and beloved member of the community. But now, he just felt like a burden. Eric's second wife, Audrey, sat down in a chair near the bed and took his hand. The two of them had gotten married later in life, when they were in their 60s, after both of their first spouses had passed away. Audrey knew Eric hated the situation he was in now, but she reminded him that they had shared almost 20 wonderful years together, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Audrey asked Eric if he needed any more help, but he just said he just wanted to know how the butcher shop was doing. Audrey shook her head and sighed. One of Eric's sons now ran the family business, and he ran it well, but Eric just could never quite let the shop go. Audrey told him she was sure everything was just fine, but she told him she would head down to look into the shop just to check in on things. And so she patted Eric's hand, stood up, walked out of the bedroom, and down a flight of old wooden stairs, and stepped outside of the house. The street where Audrey and Eric lived in the suburban village of Plympton had barely changed in decades. The butcher shop was connected to the house, but it had its own entrance, and right next door was a popular old neighborhood pub. Stone houses lined the little neighborhood, and Audrey could see the spires of St. Mary's Church, which dated back to the 1300s, rising up in the distance. Audrey walked just a few feet to the entrance of the butcher shop. A bell rang above the door as she stepped inside, and right away she saw Eric's son, James, standing behind the counter and slicing into a piece of meat for a customer. James waved at Audrey, and she walked over, and the two spoke for a few minutes. Eric's children and Audrey's own children had been adults when the couple first got together, so Audrey hadn't played any part in raising Eric's kids. but she'd always gotten along well with all of them, and she was thankful that James had dedicated himself to keeping the family shop up and running. A few more customers walked in, and so Audrey said she didn't want to get in the way of business, so she said goodbye to James and walked back outside. She smiled at a pair of young men who were heading into the pub next door, and she could see the street starting to come to life as people got off from work and headed out for the evening. Audrey took a breath. She missed the days when she and Eric would duck into the pub for a pint and end up talking to their friends for hours, and she knew Eric missed that too. She walked back to the house and put on a smile. She didn't want Eric to see that she was feeling a bit sad about how their lives had changed since he'd gotten sick. Audrey walked upstairs to the bedroom and checked on her husband. He was still sitting up in bed, feeling the breeze on his face. He told her he felt like his breathing was much better, but he was feeling a bit tired, so he might just go to sleep. He asked Audrey to keep the light on, which she almost always did anyways, in case he needed to get up in the middle of the night. Then Eric gave his wife a kiss and closed his eyes. Audrey told him to sleep well. Then she walked to the bedroom door, but she stopped before she walked out. She could hear loud noises coming from the pub next door. She thought about closing the window to block the noise, but she knew Eric could sleep through loud sounds, and having the window open meant he got fresh air. So she left the window open, glanced back at her husband one more time, who was already falling asleep, and then she walked out of the room. At 3:45 a.m. on the following day, August 29th, so several hours after Eric had gone to sleep, Audrey was back in his bedroom, but this time she just stood there in the doorway, trembling. She looked at the open window and then down at the floor, and she felt confused and scared. She slowly walked across the room, picked up the phone on the bedside table, and took a deep breath. With her hands shaking, she dialed 999, the emergency number in the United Kingdom. Minutes after Audrey's call, police and paramedics sped down the small village street towards Audrey and Eric's house, their sirens waking up people all around the quiet neighborhood. Detective Inspector Tony Carney of the Devon and Cornwall Police parked on the street and followed several paramedics to Audrey and Eric's front door. Carney knocked on the door, and within seconds, Audrey answered. The sight of the small, frail-looking older woman in her bathrobe hit Carney hard. She looked terrified, and when Carney introduced himself to her, he could tell she was confused and struggling to put words together. Carney made sure the paramedics could get inside the house and head upstairs to the bedroom, but Carney stayed at the door with Audrey. Carney's first thought was that this poor woman should not be here while the police searched her house. She should be somewhere else where she felt safe and calm. Carney also knew he was dealing with a crime scene here, and he didn't want Audrey to accidentally touch or move potential evidence. So he asked her if there were any family members she might be able to stay with while the police were inside of her home. Audrey looked up at him and slowly nodded. She said her son was a retired police inspector and he lived not too far away. Carney signaled for another officer to come to the door, and he arranged for him to drive Audrey to her son's house. Once Carney felt sure that Audrey would be looked after, he put on his gloves, stepped inside the home, and walked upstairs to the bedroom. And when he got up there, he felt like he'd stumbled into a TV crime drama or something, because on the floor of the bedroom, he saw all the paramedics gathered around Eric Hingston, who had clearly been dead when they got there. And Eric had been brutally stabbed in his collarbone. On several British TV shows, murders took place in small English villages every week. But in reality, murder cases in places like Plympton were virtually unheard of. And specifically, the murder of an older man in his 80s like Eric was just really not something that ever happened anywhere near here. Carney glanced around the bedroom. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, and clothes covered most of the wooden floor. He looked over at the open window, and on the windowsill, he saw a black plastic bin liner, the British term for trash bag. He walked over to the window, looked in the bag, and saw several pieces of expensive jewelry inside. And something outside the window also caught his eye. Carney leaned out, and in the glow of a single outdoor light, he saw a metal ladder perched against the house just below the bedroom window. Just then, Carney heard someone calling his name. He leaned back inside from the window, turned, and saw a small team of forensics officers entering the bedroom. Carney asked the paramedics to clear out, and he gave the forensics team a few minutes to search the room without getting in their way. And soon, it was pretty clear that all the investigators and first responders believed the same thing. This had to have been a robbery gone bad. Someone must have climbed up the ladder into the bedroom, stolen some jewelry, and then Eric must have woken up, tried to stop them, so they killed him. But if that was the case, Carney wondered why the thief had left the jewelry behind. Did they just panic? Or did Audrey catch them in the act? The thief killed Eric, but maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to kill a woman who probably looked a lot like their grandmother. The forensics team continued their work in the bedroom, and Carney headed back downstairs and outside. Police officers had cordoned off the house with crime scene tape, and the neighbors had come out of their homes and had started to ask questions. Carney had worked cases in a number of other small villages, and he knew that even residents with the best intentions could end up slowing down an investigation. News about crimes in these small towns, especially a violent crime, spread fast and led to wild rumors and speculation and misinformation. And people would start calling the police, claiming they saw dangerous criminals on every street corner and in every pub. Carney walked back to his car and called into the station. He said he wanted a mobile command unit set up near the house, and he wanted officers on site whose sole purpose would be to answer questions from the community and provide as much transparency as possible. After that, Carney walked away from his car and informed the officers outside that they would have help soon. But before Carney could go back into the house, he saw another uniformed officer leading a middle-aged man towards him. The man looked almost as dazed as Audrey had. The man introduced himself as the victim's son, James, and he said he ran the family butcher shop connected to the house. A friend who lived nearby had called him to tell him what was going on, and James said he had spoken to the uniformed officer, so he already knew his dad was dead. Carney eyed James and then looked over at the shop. He wondered if it was too much of a coincidence that James worked at a butcher shop, presumably with knives, and his father was the murder victim who had been stabbed to death. James told Carney he still needed to call the rest of his family to let them know what had happened. Carney said he understood. However, before he left, he wanted to know if anyone who worked at the butcher shop, or anyone who might have worked there in the past, could possibly have had a grudge against his father. James shook his head and said no. He said police could talk to anyone who had ever worked for his dad, or anyone in the neighborhood for that matter, and they would all say they loved Eric, like family. Carney said how sorry he was again, and then told James he would follow up when he needed to, and then Carney walked back inside the house. Up in the bedroom, Carney found the forensics team combing over every inch of the floor and also bagging jewelry and clothing as potential evidence. One of the officers told Carney that they had pulled blood samples from Eric's body, but they hadn't found that much blood on the floors or the walls. They believed the stab wound had been deep enough to puncture Eric's lung and kill him, but it hadn't actually caused a lot of bleeding. The forensics officer said the puncture spot on Eric's body was deeper than it was wide, which most likely meant the blade was very, very sharp. The officer also said that they still had not found the murder weapon or any usable fingerprints in the room or outside of the window, but they would keep on looking. Carney hoped the team would eventually find usable prints, but he thought he might not even need them, because he believed there was a good chance Audrey had interrupted the robbery and gotten a good look at her husband's killer. On August 30th, so a day after the discovery of Eric's body, Carney and his partner, Neil Treby, knocked on the front door of a small house in a town not far from Plimpton. A man in his mid-50s answered. He told the investigators that he was Audrey's son, and that yes, he was a retired police detective sergeant. Carney and Treby felt lucky their potential main witness's son was a former cop. He could help them explain what was happening in the investigation to his mother, and also maybe make her feel safer and more comfortable when she was speaking to them. Audrey's son led them into the front room of the house, where Audrey was sitting on the couch. Somehow, she looked even smaller and more frail than the day before when Carney had met her. But Audrey smiled and politely asked if the officers wanted a cup of tea or coffee. They thanked her, but they said they were fine for now, and then Audrey's son sat down next to his mother, and the investigators sat in chairs across from them. Carney said how sorry he was for her loss. He knew this must all be frightening and confusing. Audrey nodded, but she said she would not let fear or confusion get in the way of helping the police. And then, without any prompting, she said she had seen the men who killed her husband in the bedroom. Carney leaned in and asked if he'd heard her right. There was more than one killer? Audrey nodded and said there were 2 young men. Treby quickly asked if she knew these men, or if she could at least give a clear description of them. Audrey turned and looked at her son, and he told her she should tell them everything she knew. Audrey turned back to the investigators. She told them she had been sleeping in the guest bedroom, and she said she usually did that because Eric liked to keep the window open and the light on at night, which made it difficult for her to fall asleep. And so the other night, or early in the morning, she had woken up when she heard noise coming from the main bedroom where Eric was sleeping. It sounded like someone was groaning and something banging against the wall. Audrey said she figured it was just Eric trying to fumble for his canes to try to stand up and get out of bed, and so she got up and walked down the hall. And at this point, Audrey sort of trailed off. She seemed like she couldn't go on with her story. The investigators didn't want to push her, but her son gently encouraged her to keep going. And at some point, Audrey did begin talking again. She said when she got to the bedroom, her husband was lying on the floor, bleeding, and there were these 2 young men standing over him. One was holding a knife, and the other was holding a plastic bag. She screamed, and when she did, they ran for the window, climbed out, and disappeared. However, the one that had been holding the bag dropped the bag on the way out. But Audrey said before they escaped, she did get a good look at them. She said she didn't know their names, but she definitely recognized them from the village, and they were really distinct looking. She said one was kind of short, maybe 5'8", and the other was at least 6'1", and he wore bright white pants and a deerstalker hat, just like the one Sherlock Holmes wore. Carney glanced over at his partner. He didn't say anything, but a killer wearing bright pants and also wearing a Sherlock Holmes-style hat seemed really bizarre, sort of like he was on some fictional TV crime drama. Carney asked Audrey if she wouldn't mind giving a detailed description of these 2 men to a police sketch artist. He also said that he didn't want to pressure her, but if she was willing to go on TV and speak directly to the public about what these men looked like, it could be helpful. Audrey turned and spoke to her son for a few moments, and then after that, she turned back to the investigators and nodded her head. She agreed to do anything that would help get her justice for her husband and bring some closure for his kids. On September 4th, so 5 days after Eric's murder, Inspectors Carney and Treby stood next to Audrey in a large conference room filled with newspaper and television reporters. Police had already started to circulate the drawings of the suspects around town, but Plympton was just one of several small villages that surrounded the much larger city of Plymouth, so the investigators believed getting the description out on television was key to reaching more people across the entire area. The investigators also believed if people just saw Audrey telling her tragic story, they might be more willing to help. Carney conveyed the basics of the case to the press, and then he introduced Audrey. She stood there for a second in silence, just staring out at the cameras pointed directly at her. She tried to keep her composure, and she spent a minute looking at some notes she had written down. Finally, in a soft voice, she thanked the community for all the love and support they had shown her and her family in the wake of this tragedy, and then she gave a detailed description of the 2 men she believed killed her husband. Afterward, Audrey stopped and looked down at the piece of paper shaking in her hands. She swallowed and closed her eyes, trying to fight back tears. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes, looked right into one of the cameras, and said very dramatically that there was no need for these men to have done this to Eric. Even if he had tried to fight them off, he was no threat to these 2 young men. They could have just pushed him aside and left with whatever they wanted. They didn't have to kill him. This press conference sparked an even bigger outpouring of sympathy for Audrey and the family, but it also led to a level of tension and fear that was totally foreign inside of Plympton. People were now too scared to go out at night, and shopkeepers considered closing their doors early just in case these 2 murderous young men were out stalking their next victim. However, within just a few days, Audrey's press conference would prove to have been the right decision. On an afternoon in early September, Carney and Treby were working together in Carney's office when a uniformed police officer opened the door. He told them that two men had come to the station saying they needed to speak to the investigators who were handling the Eric Hingston murder case, because they said they were the men that Audrey had identified as being the killers. Inspectors Carney and Treby rushed through the station, and they found these two young men standing with several officers. And they did look exactly like the two young men Audrey had described. The inspectors felt a huge rush because it was like the solution to their case had just fallen right into their laps. Carney and Treby brought the two young men into an interview room, and Carney asked them flat out if they had come to turn themselves in for Eric's murder. But both young men immediately just shook their heads and said no. The taller of the two men said they'd seen Audrey's press conference, and they immediately knew she was describing them. But they had nothing to do with her husband's murder. Treby said if they knew immediately that they were the men Audrey was talking about, why had they waited several days to come in? The young men looked at each other for a second, and then the tall one kept talking for both of them. He said they were scared. Not only did they match Audrey's description, but they also thought people in the village would decide they were guilty right away no matter what they said, because they happened to live in a bail hostel in town. A bail hostel was a place where people who had been charged for crimes but had been released on bail could live if they didn't have a permanent residence of their own. Essentially, a bail hostel allowed law enforcement to know where they could find these people if they needed to until their case went to trial. Carney and Treby exchanged a look. They knew these young men were right. A lot of people in the village would assume they were dangerous criminals and decide they were guilty of murder regardless of the truth. But this didn't change the fact that Audrey had clearly described both of them, so Carney wanted to know how they could explain that, if they were not the men Audrey had seen in Eric's room. The shorter of the two men finally spoke up. He said he didn't mean any disrespect, but the old woman might just be confused. They had seen her that day, but not in her house. Instead, they had seen her when they were walking into a nearby pub. The taller man then quickly joined in and said after going to that pub, they went back to the bail hostel and stayed in all night. And they said the inspectors could speak to the people in charge of the hostel because the hostel had strict curfews and kept track of when people left and came back. Carney and Treby got the details of this bail hostel, then excused themselves and left the interview room. And immediately, Carney called the hostel, and the person who answered was able to confirm that both of those men were at the hostel at the time of Eric's murder. And so any rush of adrenaline the inspectors had felt when these two men came to the station had now quickly disappeared. Now, there was a chance that these young men could have snuck out of the hostel and made their way to Eric and Audrey's without anybody noticing, but that was not the most likely scenario, especially considering that these two men had literally sought out the police. And if Audrey really had seen them at the pub that day, there was a chance that in her shock and confusion, she had just remembered these two guys when she was trying to picture the men who were inside of her house. Carney and Treby returned to the interview room. They let the two young men go, but made it clear they would follow up with the bail hostel, so the men should make sure not to leave the village anytime soon. But once the young men were gone, Carney and Treby admitted that if Audrey had confused these two guys with the actual killers, the investigation basically had nothing to go on. With two potential suspects off their list for the time being, Carney and Treby decided to head back to Eric and Audrey's neighborhood. At the mobile command center the police had set up near the house, the inspector spoke with shop owners, old family friends, and delivery drivers and paperboys who might have seen something while they were on their routes early in the morning when Eric was killed. But nobody seemed to have seen or heard anything unusual. And so with very little to go on, Carney and Treby couldn't help but keep coming back to the idea that their victim ran a butcher shop and he had been stabbed with what forensics officers believed was a very sharp blade, something that would be in a butcher shop. So maybe two men from the shop had broken into the house and killed Eric with a butcher knife. They most likely would have had easy access to the home, working so close. But when they spoke to Eric's son James and the few other people who worked at the shop, all of them appeared to have very strong alibis, so the inspectors could not directly tie any of them to the break-in or to Eric's murder. On September 11th, 2 weeks after the murder, Carney and Treby started to feel like the case was already slipping away from them. Their interactions in the community had not yielded any new evidence. Forensics officers had returned to the house, but still had not found any usable prints, and test results from the blood samples taken from Eric's body and the bedroom floor only matched Eric. And to make things even more bleak for the investigation, several people connected to the bail hostel had now officially corroborated the young men's alibi. So it seemed like the killer in the bright white pants with the Sherlock Holmes hat was really just a product of Audrey's fear and confusion. That day, while Carney and Treby continued to look for anything they might have missed in their case files, they suddenly got a call from a police officer in a nearby town. They put the call on speakerphone, and they could both tell right away that this officer sounded upset. He said he had been dispatched to Audrey's son's house because Audrey had attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. The officer said that paramedics had gotten Audrey to the hospital fast enough to save her life, but he also said he had found a suicide note on site, and the note read, "Please catch the terrible people who ruined my life. I cannot live without Eric." As soon as Carney and Treby hung up, a sense of guilt hit both of them. They knew their investigation had not really been going on that long, but the fact that they still had not found the killers had clearly taken a toll on Audrey. Carney and Treby left the station and headed right to the hospital to check on Audrey in person. When they arrived, they learned that Audrey was okay, however, for now, she just needed to rest and recover on her own. So the inspectors, instead of speaking to Audrey, spoke briefly with a social worker who had met with Audrey when she was first brought into the hospital. And after this conversation, the inspectors decided they needed to start from scratch. There had to be something inside of Audrey and Eric's house that they and their team had simply missed, and they had to make sure they found it before anything like the suicide attempt happened again. Not long after this hospital visit, Carney and Treby led their investigative team back to Audrey and Eric's house. And this time, they wanted to recreate the robbery and murder as best as they could, hoping this might lead to hidden fingerprints or some new idea about what could have happened. They started by having 2 police officers place the ladder outside against the house, scale it, and then try to climb into the bedroom window. And what they discovered is because of the way the window was designed and where it was situated in the house, it meant that somebody would have to awkwardly stretch up from the ladder, grab onto a small piece of cement, and pull themselves up and over the windowsill and into the bedroom. This proved to be so difficult that even the youngest, most fit cop on the team couldn't do it. And so the only other option for the killers, assuming they were using this ladder, would have been to use the ladder to climb onto the roof of the house and then scale down from the roof and sort of swing themselves into the bedroom. And this scenario, much like the first one, required a lot of strength and to some degree a level of fearlessness because the risk of falling was quite high. And even with all that, it still would have been really hard to pull off. So police wondered if maybe the killers had somehow practiced this maneuver beforehand. After the investigative team tried several more times to run through various ladder scenarios, they headed back inside the house to do another complete search. Now, Carney and Treby had no idea if during this search they would find anything new. The house had already been searched on 3 separate occasions. But they still encouraged their team to literally look everywhere in this house, even in places where it didn't even seem possible that a clue could turn up. And after another lengthy search, when Carney and Treby had both become convinced that they were going to come up short again, they heard an officer shouting their names from the kitchen. Carney and Treby ran through the house. In the kitchen, they saw an officer standing by an open drawer with his back to them. Carney asked what was going on, and the officer said he'd found something that was stuck in the small space between the drawer and the counter the drawer was in. Carney and Treby just stood there with bated breath as this officer jimmied the drawer to try to free what was stuck there. And then finally, the officer got it free, and he turned around, and in a gloved hand, he showed them what was stuck. It was a knife with a red handle and a sharp 7-inch blade. It was the type of knife that would most likely be used by a chef or a butcher. That knife was immediately sent to the crime lab for testing, and when the results from those tests came back, it only confirmed what Carney and Treby already knew. This knife had cracked Eric's murder case. Based on test results from the crime lab, forensic evidence, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Hingston. In the early morning hours of August 29, 2003, the killer dragged a tall metal ladder from Eric and Audrey's back garden to the side of the house. It was dark, except for a couple of house lights on the street, and the neighborhood was completely quiet. The killer placed the ladder against the house beneath the bedroom window, and as they placed it there, the metal of the ladder clanged against the concrete of the house, and the killer froze. They looked around nervously, but there were no signs that the noise they had just made had attracted any attention. So, after that, the killer, instead of walking up the ladder, walked around to the front door of the house and went inside. And they headed up the stairs, holding a sharp 7-inch blade in one hand and a plastic bin liner in the other. Each step they took on the staircase made the house creak, so the killer moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The killer reached the top of the stairs, walked down a short hallway, and entered the bedroom where Eric was sleeping. The light was on, and the killer saw Eric sitting up in his bed. However, he was fast asleep. The killer placed the plastic bag down on the floor, then took a breath, gripped the knife tight, and walked across the room. They stood over the side of the bed, staring down at Eric. Then they raised the knife up and slammed it down into Eric's collarbone. Eric woke up, wheezing and trying to scream. Blood began running down his shirt, and he used all of his strength to pull himself up out of bed, but as soon as he was up, he just collapsed and fell to the floor. The killer just stood there, watching Eric as his breathing got slower and more strained until Eric went still. He had died. The killer then walked to the dresser, opened up the drawers, and began tossing articles of clothing all over the floor. When they had almost emptied the dresser, they stopped, went over and grabbed their bin liner, and then walked over to a jewelry box that was sitting on the bedroom vanity, and they dumped most of the jewelry that was inside of it into the liner. The killer carried the now full bag across the room and placed it on the windowsill. Then they looked outside through the open window to make sure the ladder was still in place, and it was. Satisfied, the killer left the bedroom, went downstairs, but instead of going outside, they went into the kitchen, and they calmly hid the murder weapon in the space between a kitchen drawer and the counter. After that, the killer walked to the front room, sat down on the couch, and waited almost 2 hours before they called the police to report a robbery and a murder that had taken place inside of their own home. "81-year-old Audrey Hingston had murdered her husband." It turned out that Audrey had grown tired of having to take care of Eric full-time. She missed her old life of going out, visiting the pub, and spending time with her friends. Over the years, Eric's health issues had started to make her feel completely trapped, so she came up with a plan to kill him and make it look like a robbery. Audrey went as far as to pick the 2 young men she would pin the murder on. She often saw these 2 young men walking around the neighborhood and visiting the pub, and then she knew they lived in the bail hostel, so she thought they would look guilty. But even after these suspects that Audrey identified came to police and provided strong alibis, Carney and Treby didn't turn their attention to Audrey and think she was guilty. Instead, they truly believed that Audrey had just been confused, and that she really had seen 2 young men robbing her house and killing her husband, just not these 2 young men. However, following Audrey's suicide attempt, the inspectors met with a social worker who'd been speaking to Audrey. And the social worker said it was so strange, but despite what Audrey's notes said about the reason she had attempted suicide was because of her grief over her husband's death, that this social worker's experience with Audrey had been that Audrey had almost no grief or sadness about her husband being dead. And so after hearing this, the inspectors did not immediately believe this 81-year-old woman was a murderer, but they thought she might not be telling them the whole truth about what had happened. And so it was at that point that they tried to recreate the break-in using the ladder outside to get a better idea of what Audrey might have witnessed. But the inspectors quickly discovered that it would have been incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, to pull off the break-in using the ladder. So when police found the knife hidden in the kitchen, they felt confident that there had not even been a robbery at all. that nobody had used the ladder to break in, and that instead, very likely, someone close to Eric had simply entered his house through the front door and killed him. Now, at this point, the inspectors suspected that either Eric's son, James, or maybe one of the other workers at the butcher shop were the killer. However, the only DNA found on that knife discovered in the kitchen was Audrey's. The inspectors had followed up with James, and when he heard about this knife that was found in the kitchen, he was in complete shock. Because he said just a week before the murder, Audrey had come into the butcher shop and asked him to sharpen that specific knife. After Carney and Treby confronted Audrey with all of this evidence, her son, who was the former policeman, was sure his mother had killed Eric, and he convinced her to confess. At the time, Audrey became one of the oldest women in British history to be jailed for murder. But because of the circumstances and her age, she actually only served 7 months in prison. After her release, she was banned from returning to Plimpton or contacting Eric's family for several years. Audrey died in 2016. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballen podcast, and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On the night of September 11th, 1899, a 23-year-old student named Alice Knott sat in her bedroom in the Washington, D.C. boarding house where she lived, doing what she did every single night, which was to study. So Alice rarely left her room. She'd spent the last few months preparing to take this really important civil service exam, which she had to pass if she wanted to land the stable government job that she desperately wanted. But studying was not the only reason that Alice seemingly never went out. Alice was also sort of naturally a recluse, in part because she had a lot of health issues, like a weak heart and poor circulation, and she just generally got sick a lot. So being out in the world was really tiring for her, and also sort of scary. And it was just easier and safer to stay inside. Now, it was getting late in the night, and there was some cold air coming in through her open bedroom window, and it was actually unusually cold outside tonight. And since she got sick pretty easily, she didn't want to risk this draft coming in, giving her a cold or something. So she set her work down for a moment, and she went up to close the window. And then on her way back to her desk, she smiled at the other very important reason that she spent so much time in her room: her beloved pet parrot, Polly. And Polly was sitting on his typical perch, one of the room's light fixtures, and as he saw Alice approaching, he got really excited and began squawking really loudly. Now, Alice knew that basically any minute now, she was very likely going to hear a loud knock at her door about the loud noise, because most of the people who lived in this boarding house with her hated Polly. And Polly, admittedly, was kind of a mean bird. Not only was he really loud, but he bit people and made really threatening noises and had some bad disruptive habits that pretty much drove everybody who lived in the building crazy. Like right now, Polly, in addition to squawking really loudly, was also pecking the metal frame of the light fixture that it was on, which not only made additional noise, but it also damaged the light fixture. Which, to most people in the building, they didn't care so much about the light fixture, but the landlord did. And so it was just this general consensus that Polly is sort of nasty and loud and also damages stuff. So nobody liked Polly, and they really told Alice that she needed to get rid of Polly, and soon, because he is a real problem. But Alice would not get rid of Polly. She loved Polly, and Polly loved Alice.
He wasn't mean to Alice. He followed her around everywhere and was very sweet to her. And so Alice she felt very attached to this bird. In fact, in many ways, she viewed Polly as being sort of like her only family. The only reason she was in this boarding house to begin with is because her brother and both her parents had passed away. And so a lot of time, it was just Alice and Polly in this room together. And so it was just a very important relationship. It was like the only relationship that Alice really had. And so Alice just walked over to Polly, who was still squawking loudly and pecking at this light fixture, and she just told him to stop what he was doing. And he listened. He went completely quiet, and, she pet him for a second, and then a moment later, she was back at her desk, back to studying, and for the next few hours, that's what she did, until her eyes got too tired to stay open, and she went to bed. Hours later, in the middle of the night, Alice suddenly stirred awake, and she sat up in her bed. And she had no idea what caused her to wake up. But what she did know is something just felt wrong. Her chest felt incredibly tight, and she actually felt kind of dizzy. And so she got out of bed, and she stumbled her way over to the door to get help. But she didn't get there. After taking only a few steps, her legs suddenly gave out from under her, and she fell to the ground. The next day, just before 1 p.m., the landlord of the boarding house bustled around the kitchen, putting some lunch on the table. And then when he was done and all the food was laid out for his guests, he called out to the house to let everybody know that lunch was ready and to come on down. And a few moments later, all the guests appeared at the table, except for Alice. Now, the landlord immediately noticed this, and it did bother them. I mean, they hadn't seen Alice all morning. However, they did know that Alice typically stayed up late studying, so it wasn't all that unusual for her to sleep in. But even by her standards, 1 p.m. was very late, and so the landlord decided they would just go up to her room and make sure she was okay. And so the landlord went down the hallway to the last door, which was Alice's, and they knocked, but there was no answer. So after trying a few more times and still not getting an answer, they just reached down, turned the knob, it was unlocked, and they opened the door. And immediately, as soon as that door opened, the landlord began to gag. So there were a lot of things about Alice's pet parrot Polly that really concerned people. And Alice, who loved her bird and considered it the only thing saving her from total awful loneliness, sort of looked the other way when it came to all those concerns. However, there was one thing that Alice should not have ignored, and that was her parrot's drug problem. So in 1899, interior lighting inside of homes was almost exclusively open flames, and those flames were powered by gas. And it would turn out Polly regularly liked to inhale that gas. He would basically get high. When he was pecking at the light fixture, he wasn't doing it just to make noise or to damage it. He was doing it to turn the valve in order to suck on this gas until he basically passed out. Now, Alice did know Polly did this, but she would typically stop him while he was in the process of trying to get high and just kind of keep him from doing it. Or if after he had turned the valve and passed out, she would just move her parrot and then close the valve. Or she would keep her window open to ensure that the gas wouldn't get trapped in her room. But on this night, it was so cold outside, she shut the window, and then she fell asleep because she was so exhausted from all the studying, and it was after she had fallen asleep that Polly pecked the valve open, got high on the gas, passed out, and then the room continued to fill with this poisonous gas. So when the landlord opened up the door, the reason they gagged is they were hit by this surge of gas that had been trapped inside the room for hours. And then when they looked inside, they saw Alice's body lying on the ground by the bed, not moving, and then at the landlord's feet, flattened on the ground with their beak wedged under the crack at the bottom of the door, was the parrot. Alice would die from inhaling the gas, but the parrot survived because he was able to make his way over to the door and breathe in that fresh air. And so the parrot recovered and would continue to huff gas whenever it got the chance.
When you're refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color to go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today.
Late one night in September of 1993, 43-year-old Linda Gowdy suddenly startled awake inside of her bed in her home in Stoneham, Massachusetts. She had just had this really horrible nightmare about how she was going to die. So in a few weeks, Linda and her boyfriend, whose name was Tim, were planning to go on a Caribbean cruise. And in Linda's dream that she just had, she had been on that vacation, and during that trip, she had basically seen herself dying in a car. And this dream, I mean, it was no ordinary dream. It had been so vivid, so awful, that even now, she knew she was awake, but her heart was still racing. She was still dripping sweat. It was like she couldn't fully escape from this nightmare. And as she's just kind of sitting there with these horrible thoughts in her mind, she began to realize that this was no ordinary dream. This was a premonition. So Linda was a doctor. She was an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked at a hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts. And by all accounts, she was excellent at her job. Not just because she was smart and experienced, but also because she was just naturally intuitive and had this sort of like sixth sense when it came to her work. In a lot of cases, trusting her gut and going off of her intuition had actually saved the lives of her patients and their babies. And so she had sort of developed a reputation for being this way, and it had led to many patients actually traveling to her from all over the region to have their babies or just to see her in general, because it just sort of seemed like she was the person who could handle any problem, mostly because she would get ahead of it and sort of predict complications and treat them before they became complications. But this sixth sense that she had did not just pertain to work. She also would have, these sort of gut feelings or premonitions, like the dream she had just had, about her personal life. And almost always, her intuition on these things or her visions of the future would pan out to be right. So Linda knew that in order to literally protect herself, she needed to cancel her trip to the Caribbean. And even though she knew this was the right call, it didn't stop it from being hugely disappointing. She had planned this whole trip, she'd been really looking forward to it, as was her boyfriend Tim, and also she sort of felt like this was an important trip for her relationship with Tim. She had been with Tim now for 4 years, and he too was a doctor, and they spent all their time together at the hospital. They both worked at the same hospital, but lately they had been struggling and fighting a little bit more. Tim had sort of become pretty overprotective of her, like he was becoming sort of like controlling. And so it was just sort of exhausting dealing with their relationship issues. And this trip to the Caribbean, she saw as like this easy way to like get out of their normal lives and work on their issues, but in a happy sort of fun environment. It felt like they needed it for their relationship. But now Linda knew she would not only have to break the news to Tim that they were going to go ahead and cancel this trip, but also she would need to go find something else, some other way for her and Tim to reconcile, call it a different vacation or some other outing or something to like break the norm, which had become sort of toxic. So on this night, eventually Linda calmed down from the shock of waking up to this horrible nightmare, and she laid back down and she just told herself that she would figure it out in the morning. Like, this was obviously bad, but at least she wasn't gonna die in a car crash in the Caribbean. A few weeks later, on the night of September 30th, Linda stormed down the hallway of the hospital where she worked towards her office. Linda was fuming. So she should have been leaving for her trip to the Caribbean with Tim in just a few days, but she had gone ahead and canceled the cruise because of her dream, which Tim was very annoyed with her about. He'd been vocal about the fact that her reason for canceling this trip was ridiculous, and it had made things really tense between them, and it was already tense between them, so this is like doubly bad. And now, just a few minutes ago, they had actually run into each other in the hospital hallway because they both worked there together, and they had gotten into this huge fight about the cancellation of this trip, and other coworkers had actually overheard it. And so now Linda was not only mad, but also embarrassed, that other people saw her fighting. And so as soon as she got into her office, she just slammed the door behind her and sat down and tried to focus on her work, reviewing patient charts and other things like that, but she just couldn't. Now, Linda knew that canceling this trip was the right thing to do. She was sure that if she had gone to the Caribbean, she and maybe even Tim would have died in a car. Like, she knew that she was preventing that. But at the same time, she also just hated how this premonition was now further complicating her relationship. And so now Linda just told herself to calm down. She took a few deep breaths and told herself, you have other things that are coming up that will help distract her from the drama of her relationship and this trip. Like, she had a massage she had booked for herself on her day off tomorrow, and she also had her college reunion this weekend. Two things she was definitely looking forward to that so far anyways, she had not had a premonition about, so she had not canceled. Finally, around 8:15 p.m., when Linda's shift finally came to an end and she had left the hospital to make her way home, she actually was in pretty good spirits. Even though she had certainly not resolved things with Tim, they were still very much fighting. This Caribbean trip really had become a pain in both of their sides. Despite all that, Linda was determined that, she's not going to let this be just a constant drag on her life. She needs to just live her life and just go forward, and in time, things will sort themselves out. 4 days later, on the afternoon of Monday, October 4th, one of Linda's friends was driving towards the hospital where Linda worked. And this friend was very worried about Linda, since she hadn't heard from Linda since they spoke on the phone last Thursday, which in and of itself was not a particularly big deal since they didn't speak every day. But this friend had also spoken to one of Linda's coworkers that morning who was also worried about Linda, because Linda apparently didn't show up for work that morning, and the staff at the hospital were very worried, and they had even sent someone to Linda's house to check on her to make sure she was okay, but she wasn't home. And Linda, she rarely missed work, and if she did, she called in. And so to find out that she hadn't called in and nobody knew where she was, combined with the fact that this friend has not heard from her, like, the friend is thinking something's wrong here. And so they were going to the hospital to basically get together with their coworkers to just get to the bottom of this, to figure out what happened to Linda. But now, as the friend turned into the hospital's parking lot, she could immediately see that something was terribly wrong here, because the lot was crawling with police officers. They'd completely roped off the whole area, and then there was this one big group of people sort of standing over at the perimeter. And so when the friend pulled up and parked their car, she got out and she rushed over to this group to see what they were all looking at. And when she saw, she just gasped. It would turn out Linda's premonition was eerily accurate, but Linda had misinterpreted it. So on the previous Thursday, when she had left work after that long shift and she's looking forward to her massage the next day and the college reunion that weekend, she's trying not to think about the toxicity with her boyfriend Tim. She heads out, to head back home and just be done for the weekend, but she never makes it home. In fact, she never leaves the hospital grounds, because shortly after leaving the hospital, Linda was attacked and strangled to death inside of her car. Linda had been convinced that the death in the car was going to take place in the Caribbean, and so avoid the Caribbean. What she didn't realize is that it had nothing to do with the Caribbean. It was simply that she was going to die in a car, and she did. Meaning the premonition she had was right. She did die in a car. The location was just wrong. So Linda's boyfriend, Tim Stryker, was the only suspect in her murder. He had no alibi, and he still went on that cruise to the Caribbean without Linda, right after her body was found. And he was later caught paying a witness to give the police false information about seeing Linda with another man at the time of her death. However, Tim was never officially charged with Linda's murder and denied all involvement. However, he was convicted of perjury and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, where he would die in 2011. On a spring evening in 1705, a middle-aged man named John McCall sat by his wife's bedside in Lurgan, Ireland, crying so hard he could barely catch his breath. His wife, Marjorie, had unfortunately just passed away minutes ago from what appeared to be a horrible fever. So John was actually a doctor, and a few days ago, when his wife came down with this fever, even though John had not been able to actually diagnose what was causing her fever, what he did know is that the fever was just ravaging her body and it was going to kill her. And so over the next couple of days, John just had to watch in horror as his wife basically just shut down. And now, in some ways, her death was like a mercy, but it was still devastating for John, in part because he felt so helpless. Like, he's a doctor and he couldn't save his wife. But now, despite how unfair this whole thing seemed, John had to kind of like pick up the pieces. I mean, his wife in many ways was like his whole world. They had kids, they had grandkids, they were only in their 50s, but much of those 50 years have been spent together. And so now it's like he was this lost soul. And so he just looked down at his wife and he just reached out and he grabbed her hand, the hand that he was so familiar with, and he squeezed it. And it was just limp. And it made it even more upsetting that like she was really gone. And then he looked at her actual hand and he saw the beautiful gold wedding ring that he had saved all this money for, that they both had loved so much. Just seeing that ring on her finger, on that limp hand of hers, it really reinforced the finality of this moment. He couldn't believe this had happened, but it was real. His wife really was gone. And so now, as John continued to cry and squeeze his wife's hand and just sort of reflect on this horrible situation, he also, in tandem, knew that he had to start thinking about her funeral. He would have to plan it really quickly so they could bury her really quickly. So at this time in Ireland, it was traditional to hold a multi-day wake when somebody died so that friends and relatives could have time to pay their respects before the actual burial took place. But if somebody died from disease, like obviously John's wife had, something had caused the fever, he didn't know what, but it had to be some sort of disease. If that was the case, the wake was off the table, and the person was buried pretty much right away just to prevent the sickness from spreading further. But even though John knew this, he couldn't quite bring himself to face that reality, the idea that his wife would be in the ground as soon as like tomorrow. But for right this second, John did not get up and, start making arrangements here. He just wanted to soak up the last few moments he had with his wife before she was in the ground. The following day, John stood beside his wife's casket as it was lowered into the ground at their local cemetery in front of a crowd of other mourners. Even though Marjorie, because of the disease factor, had not had a wake, John had still expected to spend this day focused primarily on grieving and thinking about all the things he loved about his wife. But instead, he found himself on this particular day very fixated on something else: his wife's wedding ring. So John really wanted his wife's wedding ring, just to have something to remind him of Marjorie, and he loved that ring. It was something that meant a lot to him. But pretty much right after Marjorie had died, as part of the decomposition process, her fingers had begun to swell really badly, and he could not remove the ring from his wife's finger. Nobody could. Other people tried, they couldn't do it. And so ultimately, the decision was made to just bury her with the ring. And so, of course, that in and of itself was sad for John. He really wanted that ring. But also, as John stood there watching her casket get lowered into the ground with this ring inside, he was worried that now her gravesite could potentially become a target for grave robbers. Now, grave robbing has been a thing as long as there have been graves, but it was especially common in Ireland in the early 1700s when the story took place, because the country at the time was experiencing widespread famine and poverty, and people were desperate. And so things like gold wedding rings inside of graves became things worth taking. And so John just felt like, am I always going to be worried that my wife's final resting place is going to at some point be disturbed? But, by the time Marjorie was actually buried that day and people had sort of moved on, as much as John really wished that ring wasn't in there, that he had it, there was nothing he could do. And so he decided he would just try to honor his wife's memory in other ways. That night, John was back in his home in front of the fire with his kids and his relatives all around him. And they were all crying and laughing and sharing their favorite memories of Marjorie. And then every time someone told a story about Marjorie, they would all lift their drinks and they would toast to her. Now, for John, this was very cathartic. I mean, this definitely was helping him grieve. But John was also just exhausted from his grief, and also the whirlwind of the last few days and just how wretched they had been. And so even though people definitely were intending to stay up for quite a while here, John, at some point in a lull in all the stories and laughter and crying, he stood up to head off to bed. But as soon as he did, as he began leaving the crowd and they're all kind of watching him, he heard a knock at the door. And so John sighed and headed towards the door, assuming it had to be, one or more mourners who want to come in and pay their respects and just sort of be there for him. But when he opened the door, it was not a mourner. It was something else entirely. And when he saw what was out there, it made his breath catch in his chest, and then suddenly he felt this shooting pain rocketing through his chest. Then he felt his legs buckle underneath him, and before he knew it, he was falling to the ground. It would turn out John had been right to be worried about the fact that his wife was buried with her wedding ring, because not long after she was laid to rest, word had gotten out that there was this ring inside of her grave, and grave robbers, they dug her up. But just like John and everybody else who tried, the grave robbers also could not get the ring to come off of Marjorie's swollen finger. So they had to cut off her finger to get the ring. But when they did that, a very unexpected thing happened. Marjorie sat up and started screaming. So even though John was a doctor, he had been wrong when he thought she had died. I mean, he wasn't the only one. Lots of people thought she had died. However, nobody caught it, and they were so quick to bury her because they were fearful of whatever had caused her fever, that disease, that it would continue to spread, that they buried her while she was alive. Just nobody knew. And then those grave robbers, when they cut off her finger, well, the pain of having her finger lopped off basically jolted her out of this catatonic state she was in, and she sat up and she was fully alive again. But when Marjorie basically stumbled from the cemetery, fresh from her grave, back to her home to tell her husband that, hey, I'm still here, when John opened the door and he saw his wife standing there covered in dirt and missing a finger and looking horrible, he was so shocked and so scared that he had a heart attack, and he actually died. John was buried in the same plot that Marjorie had just been dug out of. And Marjorie, despite what happened to her, she went on to live for many more years, just without her ring finger. And then when she finally did die, she was buried in the same cemetery and was given a headstone with the inscription, "Lived once, buried twice." That headstone is still at Shankill Cemetery in Ireland today. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.